Hello, welcome to Conversations in Catholicism. I'm Dan Chapa, joined as always by my good friend Turden Fan. How's it going, Turden Fan?
It's going great. Glad to be here.
Glad to be with you. Glad to be with you. So today's episode is on the Society of Saint Pius X, which is a unique faction within the Roman Catholic Church, I guess you could say. And they were heavily in the news just earlier this week when they received, or at least their priests received, excommunications. So it was pretty big in the news, and I figured it'd be a good chance to cover it and discuss the events, the issues, a little bit of the background and history, but mostly focused on what are the theological issues between the SSPX and the Roman Catholic Church. So, but before we get into all that, how are you doing, Turden Fan?
Doing great. Glad to be here. It's a little bit of an unusual topic for us, but it's timely. It seems as though the SSPX gets into the news cycle every so often, and sometimes they're getting kind of brought back in, sometimes they're being kicked out, but they manage to remain somehow controversial all these years. I don't know how many times I've seen something like one way or another, but I'm looking forward to this episode. I know you've dug in and you've done research, and hopefully the people who join will be edified by that research.
Right. So I think some of the key issues, especially of interest on the Protestant side, as we go forward into this, it would be keep a couple questions to keep in the back of your mind as we go through it will be, what exactly would count as a contradiction in Roman Catholic tradition between prior magisteria and the current magisteria? Like, what would that have to look like? What would that actually have to be? Can such an animal exist, or is that just impossible on Roman Catholic grounds? I think that's one question to keep in mind. The other question is, from a Roman Catholic standpoint, can you basically hold the same faith and practices that you held yesterday tomorrow, right? Is that possible? Because I think this really puts a pressure to it and a challenge to it. And then the third question I'd like people to be asking themselves as we get into the material is the question of basically, can the Pope essentially doctrinally bind the church in issues of faith and morals without officially binding the church on faith and morals? Does he have mechanisms to do it without using either infallible councils or ex cathedra statements, or those items that are considered infallible? Can the Pope basically fallibly bind people to beliefs and practices? So I think all those issues are afoot as we dive into this issue of SSPX and the issues that they're having with Rome that led to these excommunications.
Makes sense.
All right. You want to preamble or press forward?
I have very few, but I have a few thoughts to offer as we go along. I will try to chime those in at an appropriate point, and if one never comes, I'll try to throw them in at the conclusion. But I suspect I suspect they'll organically arise as we dig in.
Okay. Well, let's dive right into it. So We're going to be covering a little bit of the history of SSPX. It's not the core issue. I'd like to focus more on the doctrinal disputes between SSPX and Rome, but we should cover a little bit of the history and background, and there's quite an extensive one. And I won't claim that this is anywhere near comprehensive, but we'll have to cover it just because it's relevant. And then we'll cover the doctrinal differences, or at least some of the key ones. We'll cover at least 3 of the big key ones. There are, I think, 5 total doctrinal differences that I found, but we'll cover 3 of the big ones and just mention the other 2 in passing. Then we'll cover current developments, and then we'll get into the issue of schism, because they're officially labeled as schismatics at this point, and have been at other times in the past, and they're kind of on again, off again schismatics. So we'll be looking at the big picture is SSPX reacted to Vatican II. So we'll be looking at what Vatican II actually says, what SSPX objected to in Vatican II, and then Rome's responses to that. So with all that said, let's go ahead and just dive into the deep end. So the central question, so the SSPX is a traditional kind of conservative side Catholic priestly society, and it's founded by this Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. And sometimes people think of this as an issue of well, they like the Latin Mass. And that's true, but it's nowhere near the main issue between them and Rome, is that they like the Latin Mass and Rome has got the new word. So the deeper issue is there's a legitimate question of doctrinal development. And basically, SSPX is saying that Rome has departed unfaithfully from prior Roman Catholic teaching, whereas the current Roman magisterium is saying, no, we didn't. But they are saying the tradition has to be living and developing, growing, breathing, thriving. And it does change, but they're saying it changes without rupturing or breaking from prior tradition. So the core status is, so Vatican II came out, I think it was in the 60s or whatever, and SSPX accepts it, but they specifically object to certain parts of Vatican II's teaching. Now, Vatican II was never intended to be a infallible teaching of doctrine or development of doctrine. It was put out as kind of this pastoral document rather than infallible dogma. And that gave SSPX kind of a window to say, well, if you're not infallible, maybe you fouled. Mm-hmm. And then, so basically, the way SSPX describes it is they agree with 95% of Vatican II. and the Pope is like, you got to agree with 100%. So that's kind of where it is. And then, so Rome, on the other hand, is arguing, well, Vatican II must be interpreted in the tradition of the church. It's got to be viewed as in continuity with tradition, no matter what. Whether or not you think it's in discontinuity with tradition, whether or not you think it's shredded prior tradition, you got to view Vatican II as in continuity with tradition. And then Benedict the 16th said that the problem wasn't merely disciplinary, but concerned doctrinal reasons, especially the acceptance of Vatican II in post-conciliar magisterium. So I guess that the distinction there is it's not a simple matter of they're maybe in rebellion or disobedience to the Pope. There's actual doctrinal issues underlying that difference. Okay. Any comments there before we move forward?
I have noticed that there tends to be a sort of constellation of issues for folks who would be inclined to associate themselves with SSPX, which include things like women veiling themselves for Mass, the use of Latin, claims that that Latin is more effective as a language of prayer, particularly for fighting against demonic forces. There tends to be a lot more opposition to anything viewed as modernism in this same within this same circle. But as you're kind of pointing out, it's not merely about the new order of the Mass, which has itself been kind of revised in the favor of some of the SSPX guys, but there are more fundamental issues of whether or not they're going to accept this council and how they interpret it. And at this point you raise that Rome argues Vatican II must be interpreted in continuity with tradition. This goes to the question of this question of not only under sola ecclesia, which is what functionally Roman Catholicism is. It's not enough. They'll like to say that it's like a three-legged stool with scripture, tradition, and the magisterium. But the thing is that the magisterium decides what tradition is. Also, they decide what scripture is. And you don't get your interpretation of scripture or tradition has to be subservient to what the magisterium says is the right interpretation, both of scripture and of tradition. So if you think that there's tradition that says there's no salvation outside the church, and then you read Vatican II, which looks like there sure is salvation outside the church, you're not allowed to say those are discontinuous. You have to find continuity because the magisterium says you have to find continuity. And therefore, effectively, it all boils down to the magisterium. Because no matter what apparent conflict you see amongst them, you resolve it by what the magisterium says. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think in this case, we'll see, hopefully throughout the presentation, it was particularly hard for SSPX because they basically were saying, can't we just do what we were doing yesterday? So, all right. So moving on, let's see. Okay, so getting into SSPX's claims. So what they claim and what they don't claim. So basically, they view Vatican II as an ecumenical council, but they say that it's, well, not they say, they view it as a pastoral council rather than a dogmatic, rather than having dogmatic definitions. And that's because the document itself says that. So they officially say they accept around 95% of Vatican II's teaching. They agree on the principle of papacy. They specifically say that, hey, they're not Sedecavanists. So they agree that there is a pope. They agree with Rome on sacraments. They agree with Rome on the need for authority and the need for tradition and all that good stuff. From their perspective, good stuff. Okay. What their chiefly the disagreements are going to be on religious liberty. We're going to get into these disagreements soon. On ecumenism. So with ecumenism, they're talking about interreligious dialogues and what they call a new ecclesiology that was born out of Vatican II. Then basically, they have a disagreement on the College of Cardinals, and then also on the form of the Mass, the Latin Mass versus the New Order. So those are their chief disagreements. We probably will spend far more time on the issue of religious liberty and ecumenism and non-Christian religions, because I think those are going to be the most interesting points of disagreement. And they're probably the hottest topics in Vatican II, frankly. The point on the College of Cardinals is pretty minor in my opinion, and the point on the Latin Mass is pretty minor in my opinion. The religious liberties and ecumenism, those are the bigger ones. So I guess let's launch right in. Okay, I wanted to start out with the official definition of schism, because this might, actually not might, to me, we got to be careful with this because I think that Rome's definition of schism is different than the way Scripture teaches about dissensions among brethren. So, yeah, canon. So this is from the Catechism. So schism is the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or of communion with the members of the church subject to him. So that's a very loaded definition. That probably has zero to do with what Paul was talking about at the end of Romans chapter 16, when he says, watch out for those people that foster division. And notice it really doesn't have much to do with doctrine and doctrinal unity, but rather this has to do with just basically submitting to the Pope's authority. Now, Canon 751 distinguishes schism from heresy, from apostasy. Those are two separate subjects. And heresy requiring more willfulness and doctrinal error, and apostasy, total rejection of Christianity. So schism is this rupture in the physical ecclesiastical unity, but basically it means not part of the Roman Catholic Church. And heresy always concerns doctrine, and it's important to keep this distinction central because it's an important issue when understanding exactly the status, what's the status of SSPX right now. I have a quote there. So schism is a refusal to submit to the Supreme Pontiff. So basically, that's the way they've defined things. So with that said, the leadership of SSPX are considered schismatics at this point.
By Pope Francis.
Yeah, that's right. And they were previously, and then
not Pope Francis. I'm stuck in the past. Leo the 16th.
Yeah, yes. No, that's fine. Right. Okay. So interesting. Hey, yeah. So the SSPX use a little too much private interpretation, meaning they believe what they believed yesterday. but yes, there's actually that's exactly right. Rome was basically telling them what to think, and what they were told to think changed from one day to the next, and they were like, wait a minute, that's not what I thought yesterday. So that's private interpretation. Yeah. But you're exactly right, Zombie. All right, so let's keep trucking. Okay, brief history. This isn't about history. And actually, someone's gave me spelling. Hang on. How do we say this? Here we go. Oh, thank you, born. Thank you, born again. So Lefevre. Yeah. Okay. So, anyways, there's the Second Vatican Council in the late 60s, or no, mid 60s. Okay, and then SSPX basically forms in the 70s, but then Lefebvre issues a declaration opposing neo-modernist tendencies. He basically said, you guys are becoming modernist, and he pointed at Vatican II. And they were suppressed. Lefebvre was suspended, but then he consecrated bishops in the 80s without papal mandate. And he got kind of automatically excommunicated because he did so. But then the excommunication was reversed in 2009. But it was the excommunication of the individuals. The status of the group SSPX was never restored. So they were basically never put back into a position of authority or sort of thing. This part is weird, but basically they were allowed to be part of the Roman Catholic Church, but they didn't have their functional authority anymore. Okay, and then that brings us up to modern times. So what happened? This is what was in the news is SSPX was to continue to exist. Really, they needed new priests, and so they were asking for them. They weren't going to get them, and so basically they just went ahead and did it. So they performed new Episcopal consecrations. And my understanding is they had 6 people that they made ordained as popes, or something like, or not popes, priests. And they did it without Rome's official approval. And the Vatican declared the act as an act of a schismatic, and they excommunicated 6 people, and it stated that their ministers are in schism, and they have sacramental restrictions. And what these are, I'm not exactly sure. I think it impacts, like, can they marry people within a sacramental way within Rome's system or something like that. So that decision was made based on Canon 1387, which says a bishop who consecrates someone as a bishop without pontifical mandate, without the Pope basically saying, go ahead and do it, and the one who receives the consecration incur a basically de facto sentence of excommunication. Okay, so that's the fundamental issue. They had to, just to survive, they had to make some more bishops, and they did, and they got automatically excommunicated. Now, our counter argument to this point is, well, there's exceptions to the needing Pope's approval in the case of emergency. But what they're saying is Vatican II basically makes this an emergency situation because the Pope has gone off the rails. So that's the brief history. Any comments on that, clarifications, adjustments before we dive into a little bit more of the theological issues?
I would be very curious about the year in which the rule behind this canon began to exist. This particular canon is part of a 20th century code of canon law, I believe. So it's as Canon 1387. I assume it just has a little over a century or around a century of history. But I know that that Rome has claimed this kind of prerogative before then as well, but I don't know how far back. I know that, like, in the time of Athanasius, this wasn't a thing, that you had to have pontifical mandate to consecrate someone as a bishop. Nobody who was at Nicaea was consecrated with the permission of the Bishop of Rome, or much less the mandate of the Bishop of Rome. So I'm curious when this came to be, and also then why it's so significant that you have to have pontifical mandate in order to consecrate someone as a bishop, that now someone should be cut off from receiving the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, which is what this is. If you're excommunicated, it means you cannot receive the body and blood of Christ, according to what they're claiming. That is such a serious and grievous sin that's the result should be essentially you're cut off from salvation because of committing this sin, which in many prior generations wasn't a sin at all. When did they invent this new mortal sin? Now, I suppose that you can think of it you could try to back it off and say, well, it's not so much that it was always a sin, but it was always necessary to submit to church authority, and now church authority has said this, so now it's also necessary to do this. But that assumes that the church can just make up things and expect everyone to obey them without having some kind of scriptural warrant for it. And there's no scriptural warrant for this rule that says that a person has to have pontifical mandate in order to consecrate someone a bishop. This is just something that they made up, that Rome made up, but there's no biblical warrant for it.
And there's got to be an auto pen. I mean, there's no way the Pope knows about every Roman Catholic priest and has mandated that person become a priest. I mean, I think it's just logistically impossible. I don't know how they do that.
Well, for bishops, I think there's about, I want to say there's about 1,000 bishops in the Roman Catholic Church and about 1 million priests. But the 1387 is only about bishops.
Okay. Yeah, I got you. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. There might be some similar one about priests. I'm not sure. I don't know for a fact.
No, you're probably right. Okay, fair enough. But even 1,000 would be tough to cover, but I guess it's more possible. All right, so Lefebvre, basically, he's holding on to Catholic tradition. He distinguished Catholic from neo-modernist tendencies. And so he basically took this posture of the recognition of the Pope's authority, but resistance to errors, to when a Pope would basically, when the Pope isn't infallible, sometimes they can make mistakes. And he's saying, well, we need to resist those errors when they make those mistakes. And so his basic claim is obey Rome only insofar as Rome transmits tradition, which is ultimately a constraint on the Pope's power, constraining the Pope by tradition, and the Pope is going to have nothing to do with that. And so Rome's response is, well, private resistance fractures unity. So, and so what he had to say is, okay, so we adhere to Catholic Rome, to eternal Rome. We refuse to follow Rome of neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies. So, which is odd because basically each side is going to accuse each other of being Protestant. So the SSPX is going to say, "Hey, the modern Pope is too Protestant," and they're going to, and the Pope is going to say, "No, you guys are too Protestant." So that's how they sling mud in Rome. But all right.
Yeah. It's equivalent if you go over on Standing for Truth, if someone calls another person a Calvinist, it's the same thing.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, assuming they're not a Calvinist. It's like,
yeah. Okay. All right. So actually, we can kind of. Well, I guess this is important. So we'll just run through this quickly. And then, so John, back in the 80s, John Paul VI called the consecrations grave disobedience. So what's happened here is history has repeated itself, because this is exactly what SSPX did before, and they've done it recently again. But last time, John Paul II said these were grave. It was by consecrating these bishops, it was a grave disobedience. The matter was episcopal ordination and apostolic succession. And he said the act implies in practice, the rejection of Roman primacy. Now, when we get into the doctrine issues, put a pin in this, because it's very interesting, because, I mean, it's kind of the opposite of what Vatican II itself says, but, leave that be for now. So he calls this a schismatic act. And here's what's interesting. So he basically says that the root problem with SSPX, so this is Pope John Paul II saying the root problem with SSPX is they have a flawed notion of tradition. And he accused them of an incomplete and contradictory notion of tradition. So I think that's what's key. Basically, Rome's response to SSPX at the time was, you guys don't know what tradition is, and your notion of tradition is incomplete and contradictory. Okay, so now Benedict the 16th came along later. He remitted the excommunication of the 4 bishops, and he said, okay, now there's a distinction here. He said SSPX has doctrinal issues, but at least they're submitting to Rome's authority. That's why he allowed them back to the table. So he said SSPX has, he basically said, until the doctrinal questions are clarified, the society has no canonical status in the church. So basically, the society itself doesn't have standing, but the people that are in the society could at least take communion from 2029 until just now. And then he said that SSPX ministers do not have legitimate exercise of any ministry in the church. And I'll leave it at that because this isn't what's core. So let's move on. Okay, so let's get in. Now here's the meat. So let's get into what exactly is the difference of opinion or the different teaching between Vatican II, let me see, basically between SSPX and Rome. So in Vatican II, there's this part, the dignity of humanity. It teaches civil rights or social rights to religious liberty. Think of the U.S. Bill of Rights, Constitution, that sort of thing. It's kind of like this the freedom of religion that's baked into Vatican II's document. And it explicitly grounds this religious liberty, this right, religious freedom in human dignity. And it says that this human dignity is known through the revealed word of God and from reason itself. It defines liberty as immunity from coercion. The government is not allowed to coerce people into a religious position, a religious belief. So it's basically saying it's wrong for the government to do that. So, and then this right applies privately and publicly within due limits. Now, the within the due limits qualifier is important because it's debated. Because some Roman Catholics will say, well, the state can have a special recognition of one religious community, basically the Roman Catholic Church. So the state can privilege one church, but they can't rule out anyone else's participation in other churches, other religions, any public practice of those religions, those sorts of things. That's off the table. The government can't mess with other religions, but they can put a little star next to the Roman Catholic Church. Others say, no, it's not even that. Like basically the government shall not establish any national church. Okay. And then it says that, this is what's interesting. It says the prior doctrine of the duty towards the true religion is untouched, which is very hard to justify based on the historical claims. Okay, so this is important. And I can imagine that, Van, you and I probably just don't agree on exactly what the right answer here is on the issue. So to me, this is interesting because the Protestant reformers, like, certainly, I would say, like, even Lutherans, the Reformed churches, and the Anglicans focused on reforming the church, whereas the Anabaptists and eventually Baptists focused not just on the church, but also the state, and advocated this almost exactly this. And so to some extent, Vatican II finally surrendered to Baptist theology on this issue of church and state. Now, that might be a little bit of overstatement, or maybe just put things in a special way. Now, but just think through history and how radically different this is than what's actually happened in history, right? Just think through, like, just after the Reformation, basically anytime the king or queen of England changed, whether the person was Protestant or Roman Catholic, like, everybody died. I mean, if it was Protestant, all the Catholics would die. And then if it was Catholic, all the Protestants would die. And they just flipped back and forth, back and forth. So that's just what happened, right? Or think through the way Rome handled the New World. they knew nothing of religious liberty when they came to the New World. There were first kind of forced conversions left, right, and center. Syncretism to boot, but this is entirely different. Now we can get into like some of the theological treatises where they said things, but in practice, there's no way this is anywhere near what Rome actually did.
This is tangentially related to something I've been posting about. I don't know if I did any. I don't remember if I did a set episode specifically on it, but there's a accused heretic from the 300s named Priscillian of Avila. Avila being a place in Spain. He was accused of various heresies, and he's thought to be the first person who was put to death with secular authority on religious grounds within New Testament Christianity. So there's by a Christian state. So this is now after the Roman Empire has become a Christian empire, and he's accused of various things, including sorcery, and then he's executed for this allegations of sorcery, with the idea being that probably the underlying rationale is really his false doctrine, and the sorcery is kind of almost like a pretext for the execution. That's like around 384, 385, something like that. Then after that, you start seeing it become more rampant with the Germanic Aryans invading where the Catholics are and putting people to death and trying to force conversions. In the late 5th century, you have this. There's also has recently come up, and I know I did do an episode on this one. There was a gathering in 484 in Carthage that was commanded by the Vandal king that summoned 400 plus bishops, Catholic bishops, not Roman Catholic, of course, but Catholic bishops that were Homoousian, not Arian, trying to force them to become Arians and to be rebaptized and so forth, and threatening the power of the state against them to try to get them to do this. And when Priscillian was persecuted or prosecuted, depending on how you look at it, I'm led to believe that Ambrose in Rome objected to this and opposed this idea, although he didn't agree with Priscillian, of course, but he didn't like the idea of using the power of the state to attack Christians. But then Augustine seemed to advocate for using the power of the state to hold down Donatists, and the appeal of using the power of the state to promote the true religion and suppress false religion seems to have proved sort of irresistible, to the point where in the early 1400s, the Council of Constance was just like willing to throw out its own guarantee of safety to Huss on the basis, well, he's a heretic, so it doesn't matter. He needs to be put to death, and requiring the execution of Huss. There's plenty of evidence of the Roman See promoting similar forced conversions of Jewish people to become Catholics, and there's a long history of this, and the Spanish Inquisition is kind of famously coercive in that late medieval period into the early Reformation period. There's when I was doing my biography of Beza discussion, part of that question was around religious liberty. There's two halves of that. One was Beza was one who defended what Geneva did with Servetus, but at the same time, he also was against the religious suppression of the Huguenot folks in France by Roman Catholics. He thought that there should be a certain measure of religious liberty such that they can coexist peacefully. There could be Protestants and Roman Catholics. He wouldn't go so far as to include somebody like Servetus, but between Protestants and Catholics, he thought there should be religious liberty and that they should live in peace, and that the French king should guarantee religious liberty in his country. So there's like these competing concerns, but on the side against religious liberty in that context was the Roman Catholics. So you have this Tridentine view of religious liberty, which is not Vatican II's teaching. The Vatican II teaching is, it's more. I mean, yeah, there are some things like this thing about the doctrine on the duty toward true religion being untouched, that someone could try to like leverage that into something a lot stronger or a lot heavier handed, but largely it's to the Baptist side, as you said, of Beza, not to the Counter-Reformation era Catholicism. But then there's no condemnation of all those previous popes and all the previous councils who authorized those kinds of things, including, of course, the Ecumenical Council of Constance. So how can one later ecumenical council condemn an earlier one silently? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, well, I mean, I think the same issue is in play at the Synod of Dort, for sure. I mean, the Armenians were promised safe passage and safety, and then people were killed and imprisoned and things like that by the government, but for religious reasons. And later Calvinists, I think, started coming around on the issue and more in favor of religious liberty. But at the time, they didn't believe in religious liberty either. So it was probably more so the Anabaptists, and the Baptists at that time were the few that were more consistently pressing for a position like this.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to take an opinion about who was right on that point, but just that there was a range of views. So like Theodore Beza, I don't remember whether he weighed in on the Synod of Dort. I don't even remember if he saw the Synod of Dort.
He would have passed before then.
But I don't know for sure, based on his reactions to the French situation, whether he would have agreed or disagreed with what occurred in Holland. But the my point was less about the Protestant side, which has there certainly are flaws in the Protestant side, but my point was about the Catholic side, the fact that this is a break from Roman Catholic tradition.
Well, at least the Protestant side is reformable, and I think in this case probably did. I would think that the Reformed churches themselves changed their stance on this issue, realizing maybe past mistakes they had made. Whereas Rome theoretically is irreformable in points of doctrine.
Yeah, I mean it depends. I guess it's one of those things that should have an asterisk next to it, because there's, like, Trent calls itself, I think, at some point a decree on Reformation or of Reformation or something like that, and it claims to be reforming certain things, perhaps like reining in abuses of indulgences.
Sure.
So like certain kinds of Reformation are okay for them, but it's hard for me. It seems like you can't really say that the Council of Constance was right to condemn Husse on doctrinal matters and wrong to condemn him to death, without just arbitrarily picking and choosing the parts of Constance you like later.
Yeah. I think you nailed it when you said it's just too tempting to wield that sword.
Yeah, so it's a very irresistible thing, power.
Yeah.
And it's easy to justify too, because you think it's the same justification that the Apostle Paul had, right? He's filled with this zeal. It's not a proper zeal that he had, but he was persecuting the church out of zeal, misguided zeal. It's easy to fall into that trap, and it's especially easy for someone who's unconverted. But it's even easy for converted people to have this similar temptations, I think.
Yeah. So moving to the objections from SSPX on this point. So basically they're saying that the dignity of humans shift from the Rome's position before was that of the civil leaders could have prudent tolerance of an error in light of a greater good. So basically, I don't know, to prevent bloodshed or a war or something like that, they could tolerate religious error to a right of religious liberty. And they said that's gone too far. So they have kind of this nuanced and targeted objection to Vatican II. And they specifically are concerned that it gives a right to public acts in false religions. And it's so SSPX say that this implies religious indifference for public authorities. And it links the issue to Christ's kingship and basically saying, well, this detracts from Christ's kingship. And then they're saying the SSPX sees this pronouncement from Vatican II as a rupture with prior papal teaching. I'll go on and give some of the baseline. So what prior teachings are they specifically referring to? There's several, and I just cherry picked a few, but basically they appeal to earlier anti-liberal papal teachings. So basically there's Leo the 13th in a document called Libertas, which allowed for religious toleration of other religions to avoid some greater evil. But they're saying, well, but this type of toleration to avoid a greater evil is not the same as a natural civil right. And then Pius IX in Quanta Cura condemned broad liberality of conscience and worship. And so SSPX is basically saying that this Vatican II teaching is a change from the category of toleration to the category of a human right. So that's their kind of targeted objections and their receipts. And so Rome's response is, no, Vatican II does not teach a moral right to err, which is a different category because that's not the targeted objection that SSPX has. So Rome's rebuttal basically misses the point. But it teaches, so Vatican II teaches civil immunity from coercion in religious acts. Now, its justification, so I don't know, maybe certain and I disagree on it, but basically their justification for this is saying, well, truth can't impose itself except by virtue of its own truth. So basically, this is very similar to what John Locke said, right? Like, basically said, when you come to the era of the field of beliefs, meet that with persuasion. And when you come to the field of violence, meet that with violence. So you match force with force, and you match ideas with persuasion. That's John Locke's model. Rome basically seems to be, in the response to SSPX, following that line of thinking. Truth can't impose itself except by virtue of its own truth. And they cite Canon 748, paragraph 1. All persons are bound to seek truth in matters concerning God and the church. But there's an unresolved question here. Does this distinction reconcile Vatican II with these earlier texts? I don't see how. I honestly think it's just missing SSPX objection. The Rome's rebuttal is beside the point. If nothing else, it may be more to the point. It seems like they're just doubling down. It's just, but I don't think on an intellectual grounds they've answered the issue. So anyway,
sometimes it feels a bit like the Mott and Bailey strategy, where there's this Bailey of religious liberty, and then when somebody criticizes that as how in the world is that consistent with, let's say, the Council of Constance, then he said, well, what we mean is that truth can't impose itself except by virtue of its own truth. And then you're like, well, yeah, but you didn't really address constants. That doesn't really address constants. Like, it seems like that might not be an example of truth exerting itself.
Tell that to Joan of Arc, or
Yeah. Or what's his name? Galileo.
yeah, exactly. Right. So, okay, so that's the issue on religious liberty. Now, the next doctrinal divide between SSPX and Rome is ecumenism. So, what Vatican II said, so it's a part of Vatican II. I'm just going to say Vatican II says restoring Christian unity is the principal concern of Vatican II. So, the fundamental goal behind all of Vatican II is to restore Christian unity. And it affirms Christ founded one church and one church only. But it also says that, in effect, that baptized non-Christians are genuine Christians. So in Unitais Redintegratio, paragraph 3 says, separate communities have by no means deprived of significance and importance the mystery of salvation, which is very vague language. But they also said that there are these community that basically Protestants, but also Eastern Orthodox, they're communing with the Roman Catholic Church is imperfect, and that these separated communities, like Baptists, are deficient in some respects. But they said that there are elements of sanctification and truth that exist outside the visible Roman Catholic boundaries. And sanctifying grace is very specific in Roman Catholic circles to basically be what oftentimes Protestants would say is just, if someone has sanctifying grace, that's the equivalent of saying that that person is saved. So that's what Vatican II said. It did put in some guardrails. So it says that not all Christian communities are equally complete. And it rejects false Irenicism. Basically, there can be a fake level of unity. And it says that Catholic doctrine must be presented in its entirety. So basically, Rome can't stop in their pulpit. And then in paragraph 11, it says it introduces this idea of a hierarchy of truths. Now, this I found fascinating because to me, it sounded very similar to what we Protestants talk about in terms of, well, there's the essentials of the faith and then there's non-essentials. It seemed like they're following that line of thought, not to the same extent or articulation, but it seemed to be introducing that idea. And then it actually allows common prayer, but it's only permitted under the proper conditions. So that's what Vatican II has to say. So a lot of positive things about Protestants, but on the flip side, there's some guardrails that Roman Catholics have to follow. So what did SSPX say? They objected to this, and they say that Vatican II softens the older model of you've got to return to Rome, and that there's no salvation outside of the one true church and that sort of thing. And it objects to the positive language about these separated communities. And then it specifically says that in paragraph 8 of Lumen Gentium, which says that Lumen Gentium 8 says the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, and they really don't like that. And they say that softens the identity of Christ's Church with the Catholic Church. This is important because what they're saying is Lumen Gentium is opening the door for this idea that the Christ Church is this invisible body of all believers. And they don't like that. And they're saying, no, it's not. It's the visible union of people that are in submission to the Pope. So they they're afraid that Lumen Gentium opened the door up to basically a Protestant definition of the church rather than a Roman Catholic definition of the church. And so they connect this idea of the church, basically the body of Christ versus the visible definition of the church. So there's the two definitions, like the collection of all believers versus the institution under the authority of the Pope, those two definitions. And they say, okay, now based on that, SSPX connects us to Unitas Redintegratios claim that separated communities can be used as a means of salvation. And so now they're really concerned because they're saying that, you know, basically that this the definition of the church, that separation between the Protestant definition and the Roman Catholic definition of church, is used to bring in this idea that, well, Protestant churches can have save people too, and God can use Protestant churches to save people. And so they express the worry that it makes everything less urgent, less effective. And this is what SSPX says is a new ecclesiology, basically a redefinition of the church baked into Vatican II. So that's their main objections. And then SSPX brings receipts. So basically they're saying, well, Pope Pius XI rejected pan-Christianity unity efforts. And so he rejected the idea that all religions are more or less good or praiseworthy. He rejected the federation model of the church, basically that the church is the body of Christ, so a collection of believers. And Pius IX insisted that unity requires returning to the one true church for salvation. And SSPX argues that Vatican's II tone appears to depart from this framework. They're saying that they contrast Vatican II's dialogue model with Pope Pius XI's return to Rome model. And so that leaves the issue open of, is this a dispute development, or is this just a reversal? Did Rome do a U-turn on the status of Protestants, Protestant salvation, whether we're, you know, part of the body of Christ and that sort of thing? And so Rome's response to SSPX was, Vatican II preserves Catholics' uniqueness. Right, agreed. That was never the issue on the table. That's not SSPX's objection. Real Christian goods outside the visible community can be acknowledged. Right, that's not what SSPX is saying. SSPX isn't saying that everything about Protestants are bad. They're saying now Rome's response is that the elements of sanctification and truth outside the visible Roman Catholic boundaries belong to, by right, the one Catholic Church of Christ. Now that's an interesting clarification. So basically they're saying Protestants can be saved, but our salvation by right belongs to Rome. What that means, you can decide for yourself. But I liken this to, so some people will look at other religions and they'll say, well, you know, you can get saved through other religions, but ultimately it's Christ in the background that's doing the saving, even though that he's not named or something like that. It's kind of the same idea. Protestants can be saved, but they're still being saved through union with the church, even though they're not actually united to the church. You know, they're spiritually united rather than physically united to the church or something like that. I don't know that anyone in the Roman Catholic Church would put it that way. I'm interested if any Roman Catholics out there can clarify what they think that means, but it basically is saying you people that are not in communion with Rome, outside of Rome's physical boundaries, belong by right to the one Church of Rome. Okay, weird. And then The fullness and means of salvation remains within the Catholic communion. And that's their basic response. Okay, so we've covered this issue of ecumenism. Now, I've rambled on about it. What's your take on this issue? Is this a reversal on Rome's part? What's happening with this ecumenism?
Well, I mean, I think it seems to me that it is a clear reversal, but it presents an interesting, I wanted to say irony, but that's not quite the right word. But it's this kind of amusing scenario where one of the main things they object to is ecumenism, and then the church that they claim to be part of declares them in schism. Now, on their view, they're outside of the Church of Christ. It would seem they were outside the Church of Christ, and yet that church oddly doesn't necessarily call the Protestants any schismatics anymore. It does call them schismatics, and does excommunicate them in a way that's it makes it seem as though they were much worse, in a much worse condition, especially given their own views on excommunication. Of course, they turn around and just say this disciplinary action is invalid, and therefore it doesn't actually affect them. That's their kind of way out of this problem. But the effect of those is kind of it's just kind of an odd thing that they're so dogmatic for the importance of being part of the church. And then the church is like, okay, you're not part of the church. And then they're like, hold on a second. Yes, we are. And you can't kick us out. It's just, I mean, it's a kind of, it definitely is a weird scenario. There's some other comments that will bring up another kind of side to this, but the idea that you can have salvation apart from the Roman Catholic Church is not the view of the Council of Trent, and not the view of the previous centuries of Roman Catholicism back to the time of, let's say, Thomas Aquinas. The idea in the time of Thomas Aquinas that you can have salvation outside the Catholic Church, I don't think it's a reasonable take on late medieval theology. And it's one thing to say, well, there's just make these vague statements. What was that one that you showed maybe a slide or two before? It was there's like some let's see, maybe one more. Maybe one more. I thought there was. Sorry, maybe it was even more. Okay, yeah, there's this by no means deprived of significance and importance in the mystery of salvation. Like, what does that mean? Does it mean you are saved, or it doesn't mean you're saved? Also, is SSPX deprived of significance and importance in the mystery of salvation? I don't know. If so, then what's the significance of this disciplinary action, if any?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, you're right. I think the more interesting one is there's elements of sanctification and truth outside the visible boundaries of Rome, because for Rome, sanctifying grace is basically saving grace.
Yeah.
So, but you're exactly right. The excommunication basically moves them into this exact category, which is still part of Rome, according to this category, right? Like, it just moves them from, like, they're visibly part of Rome versus they're invisibly part of Rome. It's a real toughie. So there were some questions here. Let me.
There's at least a couple. Go ahead.
So the date of this document. So, okay. Hey, Kata. So Vatican II was back in 62 to 65. So way back. And then there's been a back and forth between SSPX and getting excommunicated and put back in. But the latest, greatest was last week when the current Pope excommunicated them again, because what they did is they consecrated more bishops, and they needed to do it to just kind of keep surviving, but they consecrated more bishops and they got excommunicated just last week.
There were two comments that are sort of related to each other that I thought I would try to address. One was from Jeff Robinson, who says they capitulate to the Chinese Communist Party and they leave the German bishops alone. And D Music says the current leaders in Rome and bishops in the US are very accepting of just about anything except traditional Catholicism. As you say, very weird. I mean, I can't disagree with those points, except to say that the SSPX is a conservative, I want to say kind of fringe group, at least fringe in the amount of people that are involved. It's not, hundreds of millions of Roman Catholics that are in SSPX or associated with it. But there are also movements on the other side, like the women priest movement, which is a one that has been similarly handled in the sense that basically the policy is if anyone attempts to ordain a woman, then the person who attempts and the women who are attempting to be ordained, they're all automatically excommunicated. There doesn't have to be any kind of formal process. They're automatically excommunicated and therefore unable to perform the ordination. It's like a really strong measure to make sure that no women are ever ordained as priests, is this automatic excommunication for that. So there are other elements of Roman Catholicism that are also kind of held down by post-Vatican II Roman Catholicism. And some of those are on the more progressive side of Roman Catholicism, not only the traditional ones. It's easy when this kind of discussion to focus on the news of the day and not the women priest movement, but that's still going on in the background. There's still a lot of women trying to, find ways to be ordained. So I don't know if you have other thoughts on those two.
I'll share an anecdote from, I think this was back in college. So it's this whole idea that everything is tolerated except intolerance. I think that applies here, but it's this idea of, okay, so I was in a college class and they were basically saying, this at a secular college, and they were saying, well, everyone's religious beliefs should be tolerated. And I'm like, so that we were going around and I was like, well, my belief is that you have to have faith in Jesus Christ. And if only those people are going to go to heaven and everyone else is going to be judged. And they were like, you can't believe that. And I'm like, well, I thought you're supposed to tolerate my religious belief. No, not that one. Like, wait a minute. How does this work? So the reason why I bring that up is it's kind of like that, it seems that SSPX is trying to be strict, conservative, Roman Catholic, and say what strict Roman Catholics have said over the years. And Rome is saying, you can no longer believe that, because it's too intolerant, and we're so tolerant that we can't tolerate your intolerance anymore. It's really weird. But
Steve offered this observation that Bishop Bonasus was excommunicated, but priests that he had ordained remained ordained. And Steve views this as a kind of inconsistency on the part of Roman Catholicism. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, interesting.
So Seamus pushed back on my comment about being fringe. He says they're not very fringe. Some in the Novus Ordo even hold these criticisms of Vatican II, and also sedevacantists like myself. So,
oh yeah, I would think, yeah. So SSPX says specifically they're not sedevacantists. So they recognize the Pope and his authority, but they say that the Pope is in error and we need to oppose the errors, which is actually interesting. Let me pull in Discerner's comment real quick because it's actually on point. So there's Eastern Orthodox Templars that are saying that one should submit to a bishop even when they're in error. Wow, that's a toughie. But okay, so there's actually a lot of overlap in this point. I think there's no Roman Catholic out there, I think, that could say that the Pope never errs when they excommunicate somebody. I don't think that's a possible view within Rome anymore. I don't know. Maybe somebody holds that, but that's wild because of things like Galileo or whatever. So the point is, Rome has to go out on a limb and say you have to submit even when the Pope could be in error. I don't think anyone in Rome could avoid that position. But when they actually are in error, so the problem is, I think it comes down to, well, who gets to say that the Pope is in error? So the Pope could be in error, but it's not up to you whether the Pope is in error or not. I think that's probably the card they would play there. But maybe they would go as far as that and say that even if the Pope is in error, you still got to submit. They might.
It is. I mean, it is standard Roman Catholic theology. You could probably find it in the Catholic Catechism that you owe a duty of submission to your bishop. It's not a duty. It's not absolute submission like the submission to the Bishop of Rome, but that you do, even your local bishop, you are required to submit to, and that, like, faithful Roman Catholics, in other words, ones who try to follow the rules, will sometimes, you occasionally will find out that, like, let's say some particular online apologist may be told by his priest or his bishop that he needs to not do online apologetics for a while, and he may comply with that because he's following the rules, even though he probably disagrees with the bishop about it, but he will just do it, and then he may find a way kind of around it to circumvent that, but he'll offer some kind of submission to those requirements, which, once you realize that there's such a thing as fallible authority, then that's where a lot of these kind of contra Protestant arguments fall apart. The idea that we have no authorities except Scripture. That's not what we actually have. We have church authorities as well, and there's a certain kind of submission that are owed our elders. It's not infallible authority.
Right, but I think when excommunication is on the table, though, it's the Pope kind of has this sort of new mechanism, new weapon, where he can bind the conscience without using his infallible means.
It's an interesting question. I would love to dig into it more, because the excommunication is clearly an exercise of the keys. And if you go back in the traditional justifications for papal infallibility, you find reference to these keys. And supposedly, that's part of what makes the Pope infallible. But if you go, like, to, I don't know, to Catholic Answers or something like that and ask, are excommunications infallible? They'll be like, no, it's not doctrinal. Like, how is it not doctrinal when the idea is you're teaching false doctrines, therefore you're schismatic, therefore you're under excommunication? I don't know. It seems doctrinal.
Right. Yeah, and Benedict XVI says explicitly the issue is no longer a matter of submission. The issue is doctrinal. Like he specifically made that distinction. Yeah. Anyways, okay, so on to the third and for our part final disagreement. So, and just for the sake of reminder, the fourth and fifth disagreements, which we're not going to get into, is the issue of the difference on their view of the College of Cardinals. And what's fascinating is on the issue of the College of Cardinals, SSPX is basically saying Vatican II weakens papal authority, the very papal authority that's beating them over the head at the moment. And then on the issue of the Latin Mass, well, I'll just set that aside. So let's get into the third and final issue. It's related very much to ecumenicism, but this is not talking about Protestants or Eastern Orthodox Church. No, it's actually talking about other religions like Islam, Judaism, whatever. Okay, so Vatican II says that the Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions, but then it immediately adds that the Church must proclaim Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. It recognizes partial truth and moral good. It encourages dialogue and collaboration, and it condemns anti-Semitism and religious discrimination. On that last bullet point on condemning anti-Semitism, that could be a very, very hot potato, but I do not know how people can say that the Sixth and Seventh Ecumenical Councils didn't have anti-Semitism. But I will set that aside for the moment. So then SSPX's objection is that Vatican II speaks too positively about false religions. And they point not just to Vatican II here, but the practices after, the interreligious events and those sorts of things that happened in the 80s, especially with John Paul II. They don't deny that truth and partial truth exist outside of Christianity. They're concerned about the ambiguity about the supernatural revelation in Christ, and they see these interreligious practices. They suggest parallel paths to God, and they see this as promoting kind of religious indifferentism. Okay, actually, I guess we can leave it there, and then we just have one wrap-up slide.
So on the anti-Semitism piece,
Yeah.
I don't know which aspects of the Sixth and Seventh Councils you had in mind, but the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, has things like one of the summary. Some of the canons are pretty. It's hard not to call them just straightforwardly anti-Semite, like Canon 69, which says Jews are not to be given public offices. Anyone instrumental in doing this is to be punished. A Jewish official is to be not denied all intercourse with Christians. That's one of the canons of the Fourth Lateran Council, which is allegedly one of the ecumenical councils. I don't know how you can say that that's not anti-Semitic, but and that's not the only one. There's like at least five or six similar ones, and also it's coercion of religion in there as well, like Canon 70. Jews who have received baptism are to be restrained by the prelates from returning to their former rite. That's the summary of the text. The one I quoted from about 69 was also the summary of the text, not the actual text, but just to give you a sense.
Yeah, I want to say in one of the canons, it specifically says that if a Jew says that they want to become a Christian, don't believe them, because Jews are dishonest by nature or something like that. I mean, there's some pretty ridiculous stuff in there.
Yeah, it's there are. It's just hard to square. It's hard to align Vatican II and the Fourth Lateran Council.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So now on the issue of other religions, this one I can understand SSPX's concerns. I think when Rome pushes back and saying, "Oh, well, no, we don't mean it to go that far," the problem is some of them do mean it to go that far, and others don't. And I think Rome itself is probably split on the issue as to are there multiple paths to God. And the more liberal side, the Roman Catholic religion, actually think that there's multiple paths to God, and then on the more conservative side, they would say no. So I think that's the issue. So I think SSPX has put their finger on it, but I think Rome is just going to stay vague and just give these broad statements that can be taken either way. Okay, so to wrap up, so basically SSPX's principle. So again, they're saying the Pope has real authority, but the Pope must guard tradition, not alter it, and obedience can't require doctrinal rupture. And they appeal specifically to prior magisterial texts. And they say that resistance sometimes is necessary in times of crisis. And so ultimately, where SSPX sees unfaithful teaching authority, basically that the Pope is being unfaithful to tradition, Rome sees a living magisterium. On Rome's side, they're saying, so Benedict XVI put it succinctly, Rome's teaching authority can't be frozen in the year 1962. And then the Pope and the bishops are the ones that authentically interpret tradition. That's was Turdenfan's earlier point way back when we started, is they get to tell you what the scriptures mean. They get to tell you what traditions mean. You can't just rely on whatever you believed yesterday, because the Pope can tell you tomorrow to interpret tradition differently than he told you to yesterday. Then their position is tradition just in principle cannot be opposed to the magisterium. And visible communion with Peter and his successors is essential. And John Paul II said it pretty succinctly: it's impossible to remain faithful to tradition while breaking the ecclesiastical bond with Peter's successor. So it doesn't matter what you think tradition was. It doesn't matter what the Pope told you yesterday. It is impossible to be faithful to tradition if you're not following what the Pope says about tradition. So, all right. That's the issue in a nutshell. I think in the big picture, conservative Roman Catholics need to beware. They need to watch their back. This is not a good sign for them. It's definitely not a good sign for conservative Roman Catholics. Oh, you're on mute.
It's hard for me to figure out how many of these data points make a trend versus how much this is like the pendulum swinging and it's now reached the outer point of the swing and it's going to come back and they're going to undo these excommunications in 5-10 years. But it's hard to see it as sort of highly likely that they will be brought like that. We should just expect that in a few years they'll undo these excommunications and try to welcome them back into the fold. But they might. I mean, it's so hard to predict. It's the same thing with Lefebvre, or however you pronounce the name. They kick him out, then time passes, and then bring him back. And then it's like, I don't know. I don't know if they brought him specifically or just some of the bishops he consecrated back, but it's very hard. They also had this recent pushback against an additional Marian dogma, which seems like the kind of thing that conservative Roman Catholics would be in favor of, and that it's only the kind of Protestantizing folks that would have been opposed to it, or at least the ones that are trying to be ecumenical with Protestants that would be opposed to it. So it seems like the pendulum is swinging against the conservative side of things. Now, if they did the other thing, if they went the opposite direction and allowed women ordination, for example, then I'd say game over for the conservative side. But I don't think that will happen under Leo XIV. And I think D Music's right that the reintegration of SSPX won't happen under Leo XIV. But I don't know. I don't feel like I'm plugged in enough to know those, to be dogmatic about where things are headed.
Yeah, I think it just, I think this has got to put Roman Catholic apologists to the sword. I mean, I just think this has got to be a really, really tough one for them to handle, because you're basically having to claim to be the church that's built on tradition, and yet revising the past, and that's never fun.
No, it isn't. I did change the view because I thought that's the final slide. Is it?
It is. Yeah, we can certainly wrap up if you want to do the blog roll.
Sure. So I'm glad to see Michelle Cherie, KJV, here, and thanks as well, D Music and Og Make Fire Good. Glad to see you here. It was nice to see Seamus Crawford and Catastrophic Canon, and there's a number of Twitch folks that showed up whose participation is less than voluntary. It was good to see you over on Rumble. Tenebris Lux was here. Good, glad you made it. Friendly Cosmic Ontogeny, I'm glad to see you. Algo OPC, nice that you're here. Jeff Robinson, thanks for joining us. Zion Z and Kevin's Biblical Discussions, glad you're back. Richard Firks as well, good to see you again. He commented that he likes the way that LCMS has structured their church, even though he's part of Wells. Yeah. I don't know much about the structure of Lutheran churches, to be honest. I couldn't tell you. I know they have a kind of denominational structure, but I don't know how hierarchical it is. So it'd be great. Not a great. Not helpful for me to know what he means, because I have to learn more about the subject. Born Again RN, good to see you here. Sugoi English 1, glad you made it. And in fact, Sugoi English 1 was the very first commenter on today's stream. Thanks everybody who could be here. Let's see. Frenny has a prediction. Much hand waving and pretending like nothing is wrong.
Sure. Yeah. Good. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for going through this topic. It's interesting. It highlights certain issues and in the importance, frankly, the importance of sticking to the authority of Scripture, which does not change, and God's word that never errs. And we have that as a firm foundation for our faith. And thank you to everybody that commented. Thank you, Turret and Fan, and God be with you.
And also with